Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the Football Culture Podcast. Today we're heading to England again and a specific part of the country. We're heading to the East Midlands, and today we're looking at football in Leicester. And I have with me today two Leicester City fans to discuss the club, and they are Pete Sanders and Phil Bolton. So Pete, first of all, introduce yourself to the listeners. Tell us a bit about yourself.
Well, I've been a Leicester fan. I'm 39. Been a Leicester fan, sort of forced upon me by my dad. Really, never had an option. I'm from the East Midlands. I'm from sort of closer to Nottingham, but my dad's from Leicester. His whole family's from Leicester, and from as far back really as I can remember, he was taking me every couple of weeks to Leicester. I live in Spain now, but still get over. I had a season ticket until I moved here, but still get over 4 or 5 times a season at least. And yeah, that's pretty much it.
Okay, great. And Phil, tell the listeners about yourself.
Well, hi. Yeah. It's a little bit different for me because I am from Leicester. I was born in Leicester, but none of my family were actually from there. So we were like the first generation of Leicester City fans. So there was no one to tell me to be a City fan. So when I was very young, I actually started supporting Liverpool first. And then I think we started going to Leicester games around 94. I think that's sort of in my head. And then the more I went over time, I became, a Leicester fan and far less Liverpool fan. In the end, it was like, who am I kidding? I'm obviously a Leicester fan. So slightly different, but I got there in the end.
Yeah, not a bad time to start supporting Leicester in 94. Had a pretty decent side in the second division. I prefer to call it the second division. I don't like all this rebranding. It's first, second, third, and fourth to me. Okay, great. So Leicester City, as they are known now, were formed in 1884. So quite an old club. One of the first to arrive, I would imagine, around that time. But they were originally called, is it Leicester Fosse or is it Leicester Fosse? What's the situation with that? How was the club known as Leicester Fosse?
It was Leicester Fosse, and it was just an area of the city. So it was basically because the team played in an area sort of called Fosse Way. There's actually a road called Fosse Road, and before they moved to Filbert Street, they played in that area of the city, Fosse Road, and so it was called Leicester Fosse as a result. And then about, I think 30 years later, went out of business and then rebranded as Leicester City in 1929, I think.
Yeah, I think Leicester got city status, didn't they, in the 1920s?
Yeah.
And so they went with the city moniker. Similar happened to Swansea City. They were Swansea Town until the 60s, I think, and then they became Swansea City. Okay, so Leicester had something of a golden period in the 1950s and 60s. They had the longest period ever in the top flight, which people might find as a surprise for a club that has won the Premier League in recent memory. Now, Leicester as a city, it's in the East Midlands, near Nottingham, Derby, not too far from Coventry. What is Leicester like as a city? So imagine someone who doesn't know anything about Leicester, maybe someone here in Spain. How would you describe Leicester as a city?
Well, good question. I think it's I'll say middling in size. So one of these cities where you can't really have much of a scene. You're allowed one thing, if that makes sense. So it's middling in size, but it's quite ambitious in a lot of ways. I feel, I definitely feel that they punch above their weight a lot of the time. And you are in this cluster of places of similar sizes like Nottingham and Coventry and Derby and all of that. So it's kind of it's hard to make yourself stand out when you're surrounded by so many other cities that people kind of know better. But I would say its main sort of selling point is that it's a place which has quite a high immigration rate, and I think there's a lot of I remember growing up with lots of like people who were from more Hindu backgrounds, and it was very multicultural, and that was like something I'm so grateful for even now. That's a huge advantage as far as I'm concerned, and that's kind of the big selling point for me. But I don't know, Pete.
I agree. I think that Leicester as a city, it's always been very multicultural. Well, for longer than most cities in the UK. But I think that with the exception of a few sort of incidents, I think that in the main, the different communities have kind of got on and learned to coexist in a much better way than a lot of cities in the UK have done. And that's always been something that, I mean, I'm not, like I said, I'm from nearer Nottingham itself, but I went to Leicester every couple of weeks with my dad. I went to Leicester University. I then lived there after university. So I know the city well. And for me, it was always, there was never that sort of undercurrent of resentment between any cultures. It always seemed like a city that kind of got on and kind of, got on with things together, despite your backgrounds and differences, which I think has always been, at least in my lifetime, very defining of the city.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's very multicultural, particularly people from South Asia. You never seem to hear of, I mean, to be honest, race relations in the UK are, I think, pretty good compared to a lot of countries. The UK has its problems, of course, but places where there have been tensions in the past, Leicester's never really been mentioned. I mean, there's been other cities, such as Bradford and Burnley, where there's been a few issues, but Leicester seems to have escaped that. So I think that shows a lot of credit to the people of the city there.
I think people embrace it as well. I think that there's a lot. I mean, I know it's a sort of silly cliche, but I mean, I think you get the Indian restaurants are incredible in Leicester. I think that might have had a little thing to do with it. I mean, people just absolutely love going out for curries in Leicester, no matter what your background is. And that's always something that, I mean, I've never been to India, but the Indian food in Leicester, I've never had anywhere else in England or in Spain where I live now. So, I mean, it's always been a case of sort of just muddling through together, basically.
Yeah, I haven't had the pleasure of a curry in Leicester. I only visited Leicester once, and that was to see a friend who was at uni there, who actually settled in the city. They're still there, I think. And we went out to a nightclub, and I had so much to drink. I didn't feel like eating anything the next day. In fact,
which nightclub was it?
I can't remember. It was a long time ago. It was some indie disco somewhere in Leicester. This would have been about 1997. I remember we went.
Yeah, I would guess fan club.
Yeah, we went to. All I remember is we went to a Bristol City game, and then after the Bristol City game, got in a car, drove to Leicester, had a night out, slept like on the floor or a couch, and then got up the next day. And I just remember being very, very hungover, and then like almost needing the window of the car open on the motorway most of the way because of the night before. It was an enjoyable night out, but yeah, it was. We didn't have any food, so that is one of my regrets. If I do go back to Leicester again, I'll definitely have a curry while I'm there.
Well, actually, final point on that, I think it's a fantastic place if you're a student. Always got the impression that if you're a student, it's a brilliant city for you. Yeah,
it all seems quite popular place with students, and there's a little bit of a music scene. I mean, because Kasabian came out of Leicester, didn't they? I mean, I remember
there's some good venues there. Like the Charlotte, for example, was always a very famous music venue. And having been a student there myself, it was. And there's two big universities there, obviously Leicester University and then De Montfort University. So there's a big student population, and it's very. I suppose because of the location in the country as well, it's very you got people from all over the place who would end up in Leicester because it was quite easy to get to from a lot of places in the country.
Yeah.
Distant from Manchester and London, aren't you? So I guess it's a good starting point for both.
So it's got its own little scene, getting on with it. Yeah. Now, Leicester City, for the size of city that Leicester is, I would say, particularly in recent years, been quite successful. I mean, it's a much smaller city than Bristol, where I'm from. Okay, we've got two teams, but Bristol has consistently failed to even deliver top flight football, never mind any trophies. Whereas Leicester's got quite an impressive trophy haul for a city of its size. that doesn't go back 100 years ago, to industrial mill towns, where a lot of clubs like Huddersfield have got trophies, or Burnley or Blackburn or Bolton. But I mean, though they were in the heartlands of football back in more industrial times. And Leicester Rugby Club has been reasonably successful, and the cricket team has had periods where they've done well in the cricket. Why do you think Leicester seems to punch above its weight in terms of sport?
I mean, I think as a city, I would actually say that Leicester, the football club, to go against what you're saying, I'd say that until recent years, I would say before 2016, we'd actually punched under our weight. I think that we were, comparing it to the cities we've mentioned earlier, specifically Derby and Forest, that are very similar sized cities. Leicester is actually a little bit bigger than both of those cities, but they, both won leagues. Obviously, in Forest's case, 2 European Cups. So I thought that we'd always kind of punched under our weight. We'd had sort of moments, but we'd always kind of felt like more of an underdog that I would have liked, because I always felt that we were capable of more. And we eventually did obviously achieve that. But I think that historically, we've got to a lot of finals, which we'll probably speak about later, FA Cup finals, lost, won a few League Cups like in the 90s, won 2 in the 90s. But I think actually that we've underachieved a little bit. But in terms of the rugby and cricket, I mean, I like cricket. I watch cricket a lot, but I know that Leicester Tigers are, one of the big European sides. But I'm not a rugby fan, so I couldn't tell you that much about that. I don't know if Phil knows more about that.
Well, no, I always thought it was a kind of common misconception that Leicester was like a rugby town. Because the rugby team was so successful, especially during the 90s. I think people's perception of Leicester was like, oh yeah, but they all like rugby. And I just don't think that's true. I just think we had a very good rugby team. Far more people are football fans, I would say. But as you said, the football team, they'd come close a couple of times to success, but we were going up and down a lot. And as you say, underachieving considering, compared to some of the other cities around us. But I do think being a one-club city really, really helps us, to be honest. I think that's what I've always really liked about it, the fact that when we do well, that everyone's enjoying it, not just half the city, and while the other half are absolutely stewing. It's, I do like the idea that we're a one-club city. But no, I agree with you, Peter. I think up to 2016, we probably should have won more than we did.
Well, I think that's right, what you say about being a one-club city, because I think that there's very few comparisons like that. Because obviously you've got Leeds is the big one, which is a bigger city than Leicester and is a one-club city. But, I mean, in Leicester, you would have... I remember I had a friend who used to run a bar in Leicester, and he was a Birmingham City fan, but he was living in Leicester when we won the league, and he was getting on board with it, because I think everyone kind of joined together because there wasn't that rivalry. There wasn't another city that was pissed off that Leicester City were doing well. So I agree completely. I think that being a one-club city definitely helps.
Well, we get the accusation in Bristol as Bristol being a rugby city, which is just not true at all. In the sense that if you look at Bristol City's attendances compared to Bristol's attendances in the rugby, Bristol City get a lot more at home than the Bristol Rugby do. And then, of course, you've got Bristol Rovers as well. They get much smaller gates than Bristol City. But, if you were combine the attendances of Rovers and City together, it's substantially more than the attendances of the rugby club. And yet everyone says Bristol is a rugby city. I mean, that just doesn't make any mathematical sense.
Absolutely. And I think that the same thing, sorry to interrupt, the same thing applies to Leicester when we went down, for example, to League One. We were still getting crowds of, 20 to 25,000 in the third tier. And I remember certain matches like going to Leeds at home where, we sold out. So there's 32,500 there for a third division match. So I think that when people do the same thing and say Leicester's, a rugby city or whatever, I agree with Phil that it's more of a football city than people give it credit for.
Do you think Leicester City give the people of Leicester some kind of an identity, some sort of focal point? Do you feel that Leicester City kind of represent the city?
I think most definitely, yes, because as you sort of mentioned earlier, I think even though there might be people there who don't support Leicester City, I don't think anybody wishes them ill will. You know, even if you do support like a Man United or an Arsenal or something, you know, when Leicester are doing well, everybody genuinely does enjoy it. And yeah, there's a really interesting account. I wish I could remember the guy's name, actually. A fella who was sort of in the hooligan squads in the 1980s. And he wrote a book on it. And he said that actually being a part of those gangs, if you will, did more for race relations than any sort of like government scheme ever did. It was like some great unifier for some reason for football.
Was that the baby squad?
The baby squad.
Yeah, that was the name. And like I said, I wish I remember the guy's name. But anyway, it's one of the things I do like about it though is that whenever I see a game on TV and you see the crowd, it does look like a more multicultural crowd than perhaps a lot of other places. And in that sense, yeah, the football team genuinely seems to represent everybody. I don't know. Do you think any different?
I agree with you. I think that especially sort of if you at the ground or watching and see the different faces there, you do notice that more at Leicester, that even though you have other cities that are comparable or close in terms of multiculturalism, at Leicester you do actually see it in the football fans a lot more in terms of the ones who attend. I think that you do see a lot more of a variety than you do at other clubs, even bigger clubs in Leicester. I think that you see more of that at Leicester than you do at bigger clubs in bigger cities. You see much more of a variety of backgrounds.
Yeah, maybe the fact that there's a lot of harmony within the city is reflected in the stands of the football club. Yeah. Whereas in some cities that might be a little bit divided, the Asian populations are more underrepresented. Because I think, from my experience of going to football in England is, the Asian community is massively underrepresented in most football stadiums, in my opinion. You don't see that so much at cricket, but in football, and there are lots of people from South Asia in England that love football. But speaking of ill will, so Leicester's a one club city. Your near neighbours would be, say, Nottingham, Derby, Coventry. Who do Leicester regard as their rivals? Who do Leicester fans really hate, and who hates Leicester, if anyone?
Well, I kind of see it as the comparison I would make is like in Tyneside, you've got Newcastle and Sunderland, but then you've got Middlesbrough. And of course, Newcastle and Sunderland, they're at each other's throats, and then there's a third wheel. I kind of would say we're the equivalent of that, really, between Nottingham and Derby. But I do, it hasn't happened in a while, but I do very much enjoy beating Forest and Derby as well when it happens. In fact, we're playing them tomorrow, aren't we? So those are the two I tend to focus on. But I think fans of those clubs will say, "Oh yeah, but you're the third wheel. We're concentrating on Derby or Forest." And I don't know. That's kind of the impression I get. But those are the two that stick out in my head.
Yeah, it's exactly the same for me. I mean, I would always much rather beat Forest and Derby than anyone else. But the Middlesbrough comparison is the perfect one, I think, that they're always going to kind of hate each other more than they hate Leicester. I do think that there's more hatred from them towards us than they let on. I think that they certainly don't like Leicester, but they try and make a big thing about the fact, we don't care about Leicester, but they do. And something that I was going to say, you mentioned Coventry, Jim. I actually think that we should embrace that rivalry more, because I think that Coventry is a club that genuinely hates Leicester. Like whenever you see fans at matches, trouble before and after Leicester Coventry games. Whenever I've spoken to Coventry fans, the club that they hate the most is Leicester. And I would think, why not embrace that rivalry with a club that genuinely hates us? And we could have a two-way thing, rather than being I wouldn't quite go as far as third wheel, but something veering towards that. But I'd lean into the Coventry one more, because I think that is a club that genuinely seems to hate Leicester.
Perhaps not this season, though. I think they might.
Well, no.
They might.
They've got bigger fish to fry this season. Yeah.
It's a weird one with Coventry because they kind of feel like they kind of look a little bit lonely there, and it's like, Leicester is the ideal rival just waiting, it's like Leicester's like sort of like three's a crowd with Derby and Forest. So it would be good if Coventry and Leicester got a rivalry together because they're not too far away. Although the Coventry fans I've met seem to reserve a particular hatred for Aston Villa, but then that kind of doesn't work because Aston Villa hate Birmingham and West Brom more than they dislike Coventry. So
I think it depends. Genuinely think that because there's so many teams in and around that area, I think that it depends on the area of the city or the county that you're from or that you grow up. Because I mean, I grew up, like I said, near Nottingham, so my hatred is more for Forest or for Derby. But if you're sort of from, like, for example, my grandma was from Hinckley, so that's a kind of crossover point where a lot of people there will feel more of the Coventry hatred. So I think it depends on where you are in the city or the county more than the city.
And also Coventry is in a slightly weird position where they're sort of in the middle of the West, East Midlands and East Midlands. So I think they're slightly more west, but they're kind of in the middle of the two. So I think it's quite difficult for them to focus on which rival. And they, as you say, they tend to have gone for Aston Villa. But no, I think Coventry and Leicester are made for each other in that respect.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. But I guess it's like, I mean, up in the northwest around Manchester. So, for example, you've got Bury. Bury hate Bolton, and Bury is geographically closer to Bolton. But Bolton don't seem to have any feelings towards, or certainly when I lived there, any feelings towards Bury. Or they regarded Manchester United as their rivals. But of course, Manchester United fans are just like, we don't have strong feelings for Bolton Wanderers. It's like, we hate Leeds, City, and Liverpool. Those three, that's it. And it's like kind of Bolton trying to say, oh, we're too big for Bury. But yeah, sometimes it doesn't always fit. And I don't know about poor old Notts County, although I think they've got a thing with Mansfield. But then I thought Chesterfield hate Mansfield, so it all becomes a bit confusing in some places where it's not quite clear cut in terms of distance or within sharing a city.
Well, I think if you want to wind a Forest fan up, you just tell them that they're not really from Nottingham; they're from West Bridgeford, because it's not. They're not. They're Notts County is the Nottingham club, and then Forest are from West Bridgeford, which is south of the river. So they're not really even in Nottingham, and that really gets Forest fans going.
Okay, well, I didn't know that. So if any Forest fans want to write in to complain, then send all your hatred to Pete, not me. Yeah. Okay, so Leicester, as we said, in the 50s and 60s, had a bit of elongated period in the top flight, and then I think it's safe to say for many decades that a bit of a yo-yo club, up and down. I mean, I remember growing up as a kid, Gary Lineker playing for Leicester and moving to Everton and then Barcelona. I mean, would you say it? I mean, is famous people from Leicester, is Gary Lineker possibly Leicester's most famous son, or is there anyone else I'm missing?
Oh, he's definitely top of the list. I mean, I think, as a friend once told me, I think we're famous for footballers and freaks, which is, so we have Gary Lineker, there's Emil Heskey, of course, but there's also the Elephant Man and Daniel Lambert, who's famous for being, fat, basically. And that's, am I missing anyone? I mean,
well, I think you kind of are, because I don't think they were born there, but the Attenborough brothers grew up in Leicester. So like David and Richard Attenborough, because there's at Leicester Uni, there's the Attenborough building.
That's right. Yeah.
I don't think they were actually born in Leicester. And I mean, I'm not clued up on this particularly, but I know that they moved to Leicester when they were very young. So I think they did grow up in Leicester.
Yeah, I think the story there is that their dad worked at Leicester University, was a professor. And Richard Attenborough always used to wear Leicester on his sleeve. He always used to say, "Oh yes, this was the first theatre I got my first biggest break." And he sort of, he would give money for things, and always would talk up him being from Leicester. Whereas David tends to keep it quiet. Right. I don't think I've heard him mention it once for some reason. So technically yes, I would count them in the list, certainly.
That's interesting because Richard Attenborough was, I don't know about David, but Richard Attenborough was famously a Chelsea fan.
Weren't they from? I don't know this. I mean, they might have been born in London, but then moved to Leicester. I mean,
I think that was right.
Yeah,
but they were certainly brought up in Leicester in childhood, so no excuse for being a Chelsea fan.
No. Well, there's a connection there to Match of the Day then. So obviously Lineker famously went on to present Match of the Day for a long period, and it was David Attenborough who actually created Match of the Day when he was controller of BBC Two. It was his idea to have a football highlights show. So there you go. Maybe all roads of English Football League back to Leicester. Who knows? Okay, so yeah, up and down over a period, but prior to the Premier League win in 2016, I think Leicester would be most well known in the modern era for the Martin O'Neill period. I mean, I certainly remember that period. Tell us a little bit about Martin O'Neill's tenure at Leicester.
For me, it was really my sort of formative years, following to watch Leicester. I mean, my first ever match, ridiculously, was at Wembley in '92 under Brian Little, when we lost the playoff final to Blackburn, who went on to win the Premier League. So I was sort of, I think 7 years old at that point, 6, 7. And so O'Neill shortly followed. I mean, he came in to the tail end of '95 when Mark McGee left. And for me, it was defining. I was sort of 10 years old when he came in. And I was absolutely devastated when he left, because he got us promoted, got us to 4 consecutive top 10 Premier League finishes, 3 League Cup finals, winning 2 of them. And you always felt that, we would give absolutely anyone a game. I always say to people, which it might seem a bit weird, one of my favourite Leicester games I've ever been to was actually the 3-3 against Arsenal, which is like, well, how can one of your favourite ever matches be a draw? But that was under O'Neill, where we came back twice after about 98 minutes. There was so much stoppage time, and it was famous for Bergkamp's hat-trick. And I think most people probably remember that game much more for Bergkamp's hat-trick than they do for the fact that we drew that 3-3. But if you're a Leicester fan, you remember the comeback in that game. And for me, that defined the O'Neill era. That's just, it's a cliche, but that never say die attitude. The fact that even though we were, a bit of a team that was better than the sum of its parts, greater than the sum of its parts was the whole point. And we always felt we could give anyone a game. And growing up at that time, I mean, it was the era that sort of, defined Leicester for me.
Yeah, well, I'll add to that because, I started, paying attention to Leicester really during the Brian Little era. And, they got to 3 playoff finals in a row, essentially. And, lost the first 2. There was one of them, the one you just mentioned against Blackburn. There was a ridiculous one against Swindon where we went 3-0 down, got it back to 3-3, and then basically gave away a penalty at the end to lose 4-3. And then finally we managed to get up in 94 by beating Derby, which is fantastic. But we went straight back down again. And I distinctly remember when we went back up again under O'Neill, after O'Neill had come in. There's a game I really remember against Newcastle, who the season before, really should have won the Premier League. It's the one where they let go of a 12-point lead. And I remember going to that game beforehand thinking, well, I hope they don't beat us too heavily. Because in the 94-95 season, when we were in the Premier League, we weren't really good enough. We were kind of like whipping boys. We couldn't really compete. So anyway, I went to this Newcastle game in what was the 96-97 season, expecting, us to lose in the same way as that 94-95 season. And they won 2-0. And not only that, they absolutely outplayed Newcastle. It was just incredible. And that was the first realization I think I had that, no, this is going to be different. We're not going to be the whipping boys anymore. And and then it just got better and better, really. I just think O'Neill's knack for signing players was just fantastic, because there's certain players that he brought in which I'd either never heard of, like Muzzy Izzet, for example. I don't think any of us have ever really heard of him. Yeah. And then there was other ones like Jerry Taggart, who I remember being confused that we signed him because I think he was at Bolton. I remember not thinking he was that great. And he didn't start that well. And I think most people were like, well, why on earth have we brought this guy in? But over time, O'Neill was right. He formed a fantastic partnership. There was a back three with Matt Elliott and Frank Sinclair or Steve Walsh. And Taggart became a club legend. So this just happened again and again and again. They just would bring in players that you'd think, who's that? Or, oh, yeah, I remember that guy. He was rubbish. And it would just work. And I think, yeah.
So I think the way that he would... Sorry, Phil, if you were going to go on. I think that the way that he would also bring in players that had kind of were misfits at other clubs was that... I mean, is it being the prime example because he was, Chelsea reserves, but he was still very young when he came to Leicester. But in later years, when Stan Collymore came in, I mean... that match, the Sunderland 5-2, where it was very shortly before O'Neill left for Celtic. We had Heskey and Collymore up front. That was a very good Sunderland side that had come up the season before and done really well. Kevin Phillips getting, top scorer, 30 goals. The following season came to Leicester. We beat them 5-2. We had Collymore making his home debut up front with Heskey. We had the likes of the people you've mentioned. Obviously, is it in midfield? Darren Eadie that day was brilliant. And we completely hammered them. And it felt like at that point, I thought, oh my God, this team is really special. But sadly, that was just before O'Neill left. Because I always thought that if he'd kind of stayed, Collymore hadn't broken his leg a couple of weeks later, and Heskey hadn't been sold to Liverpool a couple of months later, I thought there was perhaps even more to come from that O'Neill side. As brilliant as it was, I think that it could have got even better because he was that good for Leicester.
No, I agree with you. And that game where Heskey and Collymore were up front, I think we sold Heskey to Liverpool the next week. Yeah, so they only ever played up front with each other once. And it was, I think everyone thinks, we could have seen that a few more times because they just clicked instantly. But the other one I really have to mention is Tony Cottee. Just because West Ham, I think, had let him go. He was out playing in Malaysia. So, completely forgotten about. And then, we signed him. And it was a good, 3, maybe 4 seasons. He was fantastic. He scored so many goals and was clearly it was just another example of bringing in a player that you'd forgotten about. And it just working out brilliantly. So I think really have to mention Cottee as well, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I remember Jerry Taggart in a very ordinary Barnsley side in the early to mid 90s. Yeah, so he wasn't regarded as any sort of star defender of the second division or anything, and went on to do wonderful things at Leicester. But after O'Neill leaves for Celtic, as you said, things started to unravel quite a bit. Now, Leicester left Filbert Street eventually. When were the plans for the new stadium, which was originally the Walkers Stadium, announced? I mean, was that around the time when O'Neill was still at the club, or did that come after?
I think it was just after, because I do remember because we were members, you had to be members to get tickets. And I remember getting something through the post talking about this new stadium. And that was at the beginning of the season we got relegated, because I remember they had a little paragraph saying, in the unlikely event that we get relegated, blah, 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 blah. So I think they were building it the season we went down. So that was 2001 to 2002. And then obviously when we moved into it, we were now playing in the Championship, or the second division, as you like to call it. So that's the first time I think it's around then when the stadium was being built.
There were talks. There were talks under O'Neill because we were. My dad and my brother were season ticket holders. There were always talks towards the end, especially. But I think that you're right that it was kind of confirmed very shortly after O'Neill left, and then we got relegated 2 years after he left. So I mean, it was for me just sort of for me. I say now it's classic Leicester. Sort of moving into our new stadium just after we got relegated. But at the time, it didn't feel like classic Leicester because I'd grown up in such a fortunate period, being used to, losing playoff finals, getting promoted, winning league cups. But my dad said to me, this is classic Leicester, moving into our new stadium just after we've got relegated. And then, of course, going into administration.
Yeah, well, I think that period when, it was under Peter Taylor as manager, basically he was almost like the exact opposite of O'Neill, especially with signings. We were massively overpaying for players that were really not good enough. I mean, obviously the big one, Akinbaye, I think we signed him for 5 million. I think I heard somewhere that Wolves would have been willing to sell for 3. But we went in with 5, and all of a sudden he was our most expensive player, and he was
replacing Heskey as well.
I know. Yeah.
Well, thanks for that, because we had a nice little sell-on clause that we got out of that deal. Yeah. So Akinbaye played for Bristol City in the 98-99 season. We got relegated, but he got over 20 goals, and he was brilliant. He's one of the best strikers I've ever seen for Bristol City. He was fantastic that season. And then he went to Wolves. And up until recently, until they redeveloped Ashton Gate, there was still graffiti behind the East End that said, Akinbaye, please stay. And and I think on an episode of Only Fools and Horses, you can slightly make it out. So they used to film Only Fools and Horses in the car park for the market scenes. You can make that out. But he was brilliant. And then he went to Wolves, and I think he did okay at Wolves. And then, of course, he was a disaster at Leicester. And I remember watching...
Sorry, go on. Sorry.
No, I remember watching on Match of the Day and just watching him suffering and not being able to hit a barn door and just thinking, what's happened to him? Like, what have Leicester done to him? The
first season, he wasn't as bad as people make out. It was the first season he got, I think he actually got 9 goals. I might be wrong there, but I think he got about 9 goals the first season. Which, right. for a first season in the Premier League, for a guy who's never played there before, he's not actually that bad. The problem was that his first touch was abysmal. But when he found himself in positions, he wasn't actually as bad as I think people make out. But he was a real confidence player, because then the second season that he was there, and so shortly before Taylor got the sack, when it all kind of the wheels fell off, and the wheels fell off of the whole team. But Akinbaye became like a scapegoat, because he was our record signing, and he was replacing Emil Heskey up front for Leicester. And his second season was absolutely abysmal. And it probably got well deserved for all the criticism he got. But the first season, I always felt sorry for him, because I thought he's not actually done that bad. And it's his first season in the Premier League. But yeah, second season, fully deserved.
But I think he's the perfect example of a player who just got so spooked by his own price tag, because I think he was pretty good everywhere else apart from Leicester, before and after. And I think the other problem is we signed Trevor Benjamin from Cambridge United, and they played them up front together, and they were just getting each other's way. And it was not a very fluid partnership between the two of them. And there was one game with Akinbaye that really stood out. I think in that second season you were talking about, it was against Liverpool. And I think he had about 5 chances, and he just spooned all of them. And it was quite painful to watch. And then I think a little bit later, there was a game against Sunderland when he did actually finally manage to score. And the collective relief in the stadium was, I've never quite experienced another game like it. It was like a real scuffed, miss-hit shot, and it went in, and no one could quite believe it. He's actually scored.
And he ripped his shirt off in that game.
When he ripped the shirt off, and it was one of the strangest games I've ever been to, I think.
Yeah, he went to Stoke, and he went to
Palace afterwards.
I'm not sure. It might have been Palace. He went to Stoke and Burnley. He played for Burnley and he did all right at both of those, I think. So the Leicester period is strange. I think strikers is a confidence game, isn't it? And I think he's missed a few. He's the big sign-in. The team, I don't think, was playing too well, was it, at the time?
Well, that first season under Taylor, we started the season brilliantly, but I think that he was kind of riding the coattails of O'Neill. So we started the season brilliantly, but then I think, didn't win for the last 13, 14 matches of that season, and ended up finishing bottom half. And we also obviously went out in the FA Cup quarter-final to Wickham Wanderers into Peter Taylor's first season. And then he really threw off, and then we obviously went down the following season.
I was going to mention the FA Cup game. That seemed to be the moment when it all just completely fell apart. It was being held together with tape, and then I think, that Wickham semi-final. No, was it? No, quarter-final, wasn't it?
Yeah, quarter-final.
And it just completely fell apart after that.
With someone that signed from Teletext.
Amazing story.
Yeah. I was about to say when you go out of the cup to a player that was signed on Teletext, you know that things are not going in the right direction at all.
Yeah, great footballing story. Terrible for us.
Yeah. So so Leicester go down into the second division, the Championship, Division 1, whatever they were calling it at the time, I don't remember, and move into the Walkers Stadium. And there was a relegation under Ian Holloway. Was that caused by financial problems at the club? What happened there? I mean, was it the paying for the new stadium, or what caused the problems?
Not when we went down to League One. That wasn't financial, because obviously when we went down from the Premier League to the Championship, we went into administration and we got promoted, and those were in the days before there were points deductions for administration. So it was quite controversial. I remember Neil Warnock being furious because Sheffield United had finished third, and he was saying, if Leicester should have had a points deduction, they're in administration. So that point wasn't really, that was the financial problems. When we went down to League One under Holloway, was far from it, because we'd just been bought by Milan Mandaric. So we thought we were rolling in it, and we thought, we're going to get promoted to the Premier League. And it was an absolute disaster, initially at least, where, we had that season which eventually ended with Holloway taking us down. But we'd started the season with Martin Allen as manager, Gary Megson, who then left for Bolton, which sounds really depressing, because they were in the Premier League at the time. Holloway came in and took us down. So it was just an absolutely disastrous season, but it wasn't financially. It was just complete mismanagement from all levels. At all levels.
It's definitely one. Well, it was a utterly absurd season, because you say we started with Martin Allen, and then they made a series of signings, and I don't think any of them ended up playing for us in any serious way. There was some Iranian right back who had played in the World Cup called Kaibi, and it was like, it's such a coup, we signed this guy, and he never played. And then there was this other, there was just this bunch of players, and that were just hopeless. And then Martin Allen's last game was an FA Cup game against Forest, and then we had a player, Clive Clark, on loan, who had a heart attack at half time. So that was going on, and then Megson came in, and basically, I think, was it 6 games? Because then Bolton Wanderers took him as manager. So that was that. So we needed a third manager, who was Holloway. And again, he brought in a whole bunch of new players. There was a couple of Hungarians, I seem to remember, coming in.
He made a couple of decent signings that ended up being good for us. But the Hungarian
Steve Howard came in, didn't he?
Steve Howard and Matt Oakley, who were both quite good when we went down to League One. But a couple of completely random, useless signings as well. But at least, whilst they didn't work in terms of keeping us up, Matt Oakley and Steve Howard were big parts of the side that got us promoted again from League One the following season. But I was furious with Holloway. I mean, it wasn't his fault entirely. There were huge things going on at the club, but I do think you have to take responsibility when you take a club that's never been into the third tier. The manager has to take some sort of responsibility. So I was furious with him for years over that.
He reminded me a bit of Boris Johnson, I have to say, because, it's all very funny, very jovial, but when things start going wrong, it's not funny anymore, and suddenly he's the most irritating person in the universe. So I kind of always make that comparison with Holloway.
Oh, do you think Pete, you might disagree because you think, you thought Leicester had underachieved somewhat, but do you think it's quite an achievement that it wasn't until that time that Leicester had ever been in the third division? Because there's been some big clubs that have been down there in the past: Sheffield Wednesday, Aston Villa, Manchester City, Leeds.
I agree. I think it's something that that was there to be proud of. So I think it's disgraceful that we, lost that record of being one of the few clubs that had never been out of the top 2 divisions. Because, like you said, there's some massive clubs that had been down there before Leicester. So the fact that we were one of that, I wouldn't say elite, because it's hardly elite saying, we've never been in the third division, but it is something to be proud of, when you consider the size of some of the clubs that had been down there before and we hadn't. So yeah, the fact that was taken away from us was annoying.
Well, it's
I think it's clutching at straws a little bit, though, isn't it? When you haven't I mean, okay, we've won some league cups, but we've never won the FA Cup. We hadn't come close to winning, a league or anything like that. So I always thought it was one of these achievements that we could talk about ourselves to make up for the fact that we lost a lot of finals, really.
Yeah.
There can't be that many clubs though that are top two division clubs. I mean, there'll be obvious ones like Manchester United and Arsenal, etc. But
Everton,
I mean, like
Everton are there as well. Everton,
yeah, Newcastle have never been in the third tier. Sunderland obviously have, but yeah, there's not that many clubs that belong to that group. In terms of 92 professional clubs, there's not a huge amount that have never been in the only in the top two divisions. So I don't know, it's something minor to hold on to, I think. Okay, so you came back up from the third tier. Was it Nigel Pearson who was the coach?
Yep.
First spell. Okay, so what was Pearson's effect on the club in his first spell?
Well, I think for me and quite a lot of people I know, Nigel Pearson is our favourite Leicester City manager, just because it was absolute rock bottom, starting from zero, clearing out all dead wood, and he sort of like helped us create an identity again, really. And quite similar to O'Neill in the sense that him and his team was excellent with recruitment. I think almost immediately they sort of brought in players that suited us. And that particular season, it was just such a confidence builder because there was a fair few seasons where we were just really insipid or, losing a lot to the extent that we obviously got relegated. So just to have a season there where we could just start winning again and players, were performing. And I remember Matty Fright had a particularly good season that year. And it was just the beginning of everything. So, I think, that was the start of what became the Premier League win. It all started there, in my opinion. I mean, Peter, what do you say?
I agree completely. I think that he sort of was the catalyst of it all. I mean, it not just him, because he brought in Craig Shakespeare and Steve Walsh with him, who were really important with it all. Because I think Steve Walsh was the sort of chief scout, and obviously Shakespeare being Pearson's assistant, and the three of them together sort of seemed to really connect with the fans, the club, and understand stuff, and most importantly, got results on the pitch and were brilliant in the transfer market. I mean, obviously Vardy, who we might mention later, is probably the most famous one, but the number of incredible signings they made, not only when we got to the Premier League, but League One, Championship, it was just relentless in terms of excellent recruitment and really creating a harmony within the squad and the club that there hadn't been for years.
Yeah, and an early one he brought in was Lloyd Dyer, who, again, I don't think I'd heard of, but he played for us. It was about 10 years or so. We got so much service out of him. And then there was really like sensible signings. Like we brought in Chris Powell, who at the time was 39. But in League One, just given his experience, I remember him being brilliant for us. He was right at the end of his career, but that was another just really astute signing. And we hadn't really made many of them in the past few years. So, I think
we did a couple like that. There was Powell was one, that one in the first season, and then also when we got promoted from the Championship a few years later under Pearson's second spell, we brought in Kevin Pearson, if you remember, signed him, I think, sort of January time, for the last sort of few seasons of his career, and he was brilliant for us, absolutely brilliant. So I think that there were a number of signings that he made that especially sort of older ones like the ones we've mentioned, who really made a big difference for us.
Was this Kevin Phillips?
Kevin Phillips, sorry. What did I say?
Yeah. Okay, no, I got you. Yeah, sorry, I was like, hang on a minute. Gary Taylor Fletcher as well. That was another one.
Yeah, Gary.
So basically, I always trusted their recruitment process, and it's always so nice when you support a team, they're going to make good signings, because that does not always happen, as we would, later find out.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting then. So obviously Nigel Pearson's the most popular manager in Leicester history. Here's the question. So Leicester surprisingly win the Premier League in 2016. I mean, for me, it wasn't surprising as the season went on because you could see they were a good side and they just weren't going to go away. I think after Christmas, I think it's pretty obvious they weren't going to drop off if they stayed the course that long. But who takes responsibility for the Premier League title win? Is it Nigel Pearson or is it Claudio Ranieri?
Well, it's a bit of both. I mean, I think that obviously we wouldn't have won the Premier League without Pearson's influence in the numerous seasons beforehand in his 2 spells. Because, I mean, most of that title-winning side, aside from Kante, who we signed after Pearson had left, that side was Pearson's. I mean, even the signings that hadn't played, he'd made before he'd been sacked. So I'm thinking about Christian Fuchs, Okazaki. Pearson had made those signings, and then Kante was made after he left. So really, the side was Pearson's, and a lot of the mentality within the group, I think, was cultivated by Pearson. So we would never have done it without him. But Phil might disagree with me on this. I don't think we would ever have won the Premier League under Pearson himself, because I think that Ranieri's management that season was the best management in every way I can ever imagine, because he dealt with absolutely every single facet of that season perfectly. The media, he was brilliant with, substitutions, team selection, the way he connected with the fans, everything was brilliant. And I think the fact that he'd been in, although he'd never won a league, even though he'd managed some massive clubs before, he'd never won a league title before. But I think perhaps the fact that he'd been in situations where he'd managed really big clubs, it didn't faze him quite as much, being in a position where you're towards the top of the Premier League. So I think that both have to take credit, both massively.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, because the foundation was definitely all Pearson. But the way I see it, Ranieri did 3 things right. So when he came in, he was smart enough to realise that this is quite a good team. I don't really need to change that much. And he even kept on Craig Shakespeare and Steve Walsh, because, I assumed they would go with Pearson, but they didn't. They stuck around. So he knew it was good. Don't try and change too much. And then the other thing he did right was he recognised that really the formation should be set up to give chances to Vardy. Because I don't know if you remember this bit, because Vardy used to, Pearson used to play him out wide sometimes. Yeah. And he wasn't always front and centre. Sometimes, in that first Premier League season under Pearson, Vardy had a bit more of a wide role until the end of the season, whereas Ranieri came in and said, no, let's play 4-4-2, make sure you get Vardy chances. And then I guess the other thing was that because of his experience, he knew how to deal with players like Mahrez, who, he's the type of personality, he's, I guess he's a bit like Eric Cantona. You can't really treat him like the rest, because what he can do is so incredible. So you needed a manager with quite a lot of experience of working with bigger players like that to get the best out of Riyad Mahrez as well. So that's the 3 things I think he did really, really well. And perhaps a 4th was there was that period where he really tightened up the defence and we got a lot of 1-0 wins.
Well, that was after doing promising them that he'd buy them a pizza if they got a clean sheet. At the start of that season, it was weird because at the start of that season, we were scoring goals, but also leaking loads of goals. I remember a really good game where we played very well, but we lost 5-2 at home to Arsenal the season we won the league. And we were so open and playing really good football. But it was in complete contrast to how we finished the season, where we got a lot of, ground out 1-0 victories. And I think that it was, really credit to Ranieri, what he did with us defensively that season.
Yeah, that's true. And there was a lot of we went 2-0 down quite a lot, didn't we, at the beginning of the season? We had to bring it back to 2 draws. But I guess to answer your question, it really is, both who are responsible, because I think Ranieri did things that Pearson couldn't, but without everything that Pearson had done beforehand, we never would have got close to that league title. So yeah.
So is that the blueprint for Premier League success if you're not one of the super clubs then? Nigel Pearson, director of football, and Claudio Ranieri is your coach on the on the touchline and on the training pitch. Who knows?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so you've won the Premier League. You're Leicester City. No disrespect, but not a super club. Where do you go from there as a fan? Because it's not going to get any better than that, is it? Well, how did you guys feel after you'd won it? I mean, obviously there's the elation of winning it, but once you've won it, how did you feel? Where do you go from there?
Well, what I would say is that I think during that season, we all knew this was not going to happen again. I don't think any of us were under the impression that, all right, this is the beginning of multiple titles and we're going to conquer Europe. I think, I am glad it happened when it did, because I think I was old enough to appreciate it for what it was. And I don't know how it was for you, P, but pretty much everyone I knew, we knew this was it. It was our only chance.
Yeah.
And we really had to take it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that all Leicester fans at that stage were saying, like, it doesn't matter what happens after this season. Just win this. Just get this done. Win it. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if we get relegated next season. It doesn't matter. Just win this, because we knew it was our only chance. But the thing is, I mean, it's human nature and football fan nature that even though you've won the league, it starts again. So then the following season, you've won the league and it was incredible. And at the time, I'd have said to you, fine, it doesn't matter if we get relegated next season. It doesn't matter if we go down to the third tier again, just as long as we win this Premier League. But then once it's happened, you're not going to go to matches thinking, it doesn't matter because we won the league. It's not that your ambitions get bigger. It's just the fact that it's in the nature of a football fan. You want to see the team winning, regardless of what you've done before. So I think it kind of resets to an extent. You've got that credit in the bank, but it does kind of reset a little bit. And I think that sometimes that annoys me a little bit about Leicester fans as a mentality. It's like, well, where were you when we were, in League One? It's like, well, I was watching us in League One too. But it still doesn't mean that, I don't want us to win now and keep maintaining this. I'm not saying I want us to win the league again, because I know that'll never happen. But I think it's in a football fan's nature to keep demanding success, especially when you've tasted it very recently.
Yeah, although the following season, I think what I wanted most was for us to have a decent run in the Champions League. Because again, I think we knew it wasn't likely we would qualify for the Champions League that often. And in fact, we haven't again. But I think I wanted us to, give a good account of ourselves in Europe. And we did. So I was really pleased about that, even if the, domestic season didn't go quite so well.
So should Ranieri have been given at least that season, having achieved what he had achieved there? Or was it right to fire him when he went?
No, it was awful. It was.
He had to go.
Yeah, we were sleepwalking into relegation, and you always know it's time to go when you lose a game at home 3-0, and then if it's a one-off result, it happens. Never mind. But to do it repeatedly, as I think we were doing, I seem to remember we were just losing really, really pathetically, game on game, and not learning from the game before. And, there's no other option, I think.
And I think that Ranieri went back to his sort of stereotype that second season, because the first season at Leicester, he was so consistent. I mean, after the first sort of 7-8 games when he got his team settled, you could name our lineup. Every team in the country knew what 11 we were going to be playing. But then that second season, when it was starting to go wrong, he was just making all sorts of strange decisions when no one in the stadium could understand what on earth is he trying to do here. And that just wasn't the case in his first season. Every single decision he made seemed logical and generally worked. Whereas in his second season, he was chopping and changing. He was trying weird formations. And he'd gone back to that. So I don't want to use the term Tinkerman because I think it's disrespectful towards him. But people were saying that about him. And it was kind of true in that second season. And so as horrible as it was, and as much as I love him, and I would have loved him not to get sacked, he had to go. Because, I mean, immediately after he left, our upturn in form domestically was enormous. And we would have, despite the fact that he'd got us through to the quarterfinals of the Champions League. I mean, well, halfway there, because he did the first leg in Sevilla. And then he wasn't there for the second leg. But I mean, he had a big part in getting us to the quarterfinals. So it was awful to have to see him go. But he did, yeah. He had to go.
Yeah, because I mean, well, I'm glad you mentioned it because it was astonishing. I remember like the first game after he went was against Liverpool, and all of a sudden we were back. You know, I think we beat them 3-1. It should have been 3-0. They grabbed the goal at the end, but just in an instant, the team just returned to their former selves under Craig Shakespeare. And then you're right, the game against Sevilla in the Champions League, which I think is my favourite ever Leicester City match of all time, I have to say, that second leg, because I was living in Sevilla at the time, as you are. So I remember that I went to the first one and, at Sanchez Pizjuan, and we should have been 4-0 down at half time. Oh, yeah. Somehow we came away with only, a 2-1 defeat. But then by the time Sevilla came back, it was all changed. Ranieri had gone and we just blew him away. And it was just a nice, return to how things used to be. And I think that Sevilla team, that was the last sort of big scalp for that team, I think.
And I agree with you because I was at both. I was living in Salamanca, still in Spain, but in Salamanca that season. And I came down to Seville, and my brother flew over from England, and we went to Sevilla away. And I mean, yeah, you're right. We should have lost 4-0. I mean, Casper saved a penalty. They missed a hatful of chances, and we ended up losing 2-1. And you could see to Ranieri, I mean, that was his last game in charge. You could see how much it meant when Vardy got that late goal because he knew how important that was going to be. I mean, it ended up, we won 2-0 in Leicester anyway. Yeah. But I went to both games. And I think up there with the game I mentioned earlier, the Arsenal 3-3, I think that the Sevilla 2-0 at home is right up there with the Arsenal 3-3 for me.
Yeah, well, after those glory days, there was the tragic death of the owner, wasn't there? How much of an effect did that have on the club? How hands-on was he? And do you attribute the Premier League success, down to the owner of the club as well?
Well, I think they're still feeling the effects of it now, to be honest, because as a chairman, he didn't really put a foot wrong. It was quite incredible, really, because I think he understood what a lot of club owners don't, that when you sort of buy a club, you really have to get the people of the city on side. So, they sort of invested in the city and they did these little things where you could get a free donut or free beer or something, which, some might say is cynical, but, the fans loved it. And he was very, very smart with that sort of stuff. And, well, the success speaks for itself. I felt that he was a very, very smart guy, and his loss still resonates now. They just haven't really been able to replace it in the same way.
I think after a few missteps initially, because when they first came in, I mean, Pearson was got rid of. Not under them. It was actually Mandarich who sacked Pearson, and then they came in shortly afterwards and appointed Paulo Sousa was the first manager they had, and then it was Sven Göran Eriksson, and before they went back to Pearson. And so there were a couple of early, missteps, but then you're right, Phil, he didn't put a foot wrong. I mean, I've never really been that comfortable with them. I don't really like the fact that they were idolised so much by Leicester fans. I don't really like the fact that there's a statue of him outside the ground. To be honest, I think that, a statue of Ranieri, Vardy, I'd like that. I don't really like the idea of a chairman being this figure that you idolise. And I really didn't like when we won the league, for example, I really didn't like them taking a portrait of the Thai king onto the pitch. I mean, I thought, well, what's the Thai royal family got to do with Leicester winning the league? So there were things that, for me, but I'm cynical at nature, maybe. So that's maybe just me being a little bit critical for the sake of it. But you're right. After those initial missteps, he as a chairman, in the sort of way that the football ownership works, he didn't put a foot wrong. He was brilliant. His son, on the other hand, is a disgrace. But I mean, he was brilliant.
But I do think, we've seen countless of examples of like a chairman absolutely destroying a team elsewhere. I'm thinking the one that sticks in my head was it was the guy at Cardiff, Vincent Tan. It was like he made them all wear red and just clearly was at odds with the fan base. And Blackpool we've mentioned earlier, they've had terrible trouble with it, haven't they? So I just think, as football chairmen go, we got pretty lucky. And
we did.
No, I agree with you. No, I'm not really one to idolise anybody like that, but at the same time, I think compared to what we could have had, I think we got pretty lucky.
Yeah.
Well, this is the ownership thing, and Bristol City fans. Steve Lansdown's looking to sell the club, and Bristol City fans are, some of them are begging for, a rich benefactor to come in and push the club on. But be careful what you wish for, because it's a bit of a gamble as to who you end up owning the club. But okay, so Leicester won the Premier League. You think it couldn't get any better than that? Not quite as good as winning the league, but Leicester did win the FA Cup under Brendan Rodgers, who clearly thought that Leicester was a bigger club than Celtic, leaving Celtic for Leicester. What do you remember about the FA Cup win and the Brendan Rodgers era?
Well, it's the reverse of O'Neill, isn't it? He left us for a bigger club, Celtic, and then all those years later, we got Celtic's manager. But I do think there was 2 seasons. One of them was the COVID one, so 1920, and then the season after when we won the FA Cup. I think objectively that was probably the best Leicester City team in terms of the players they had.
I agree.
If I list them all, because obviously we still had the nucleus, we still had Schmeichel and Vardy, and Albright was still there, but then we had like James Maddison, Harvey Barnes, Iheanacho had a couple of really good seasons. I mean, we had Chilwell as well, Fofana,
Tielemans.
Tielemans, yeah, obviously Tielemans. So it's like, I think that was probably our best ever team. In terms of the players we had and the quality. And then I'm really glad they actually did win a trophy, because, I think that team really should have won something. And
I agree. I think that this is kind of, I don't want to make it all about Rodgers, but I think that Rodgers is kind of like the opposite of what he claims to be, because I don't think he's very good at building a side. He's very good with other people's players. And when he first came into Leicester, he inherited a brilliant side, because like Phil said, I mean, he's mentioned all the players there, but none of them were signed by Rodgers. Aside from Fofana, they were all signed, in previous seasons with Claude Puel or Ranieri, with the case of Ndidi, for example. And he inherited all these players, and he was absolutely brilliant for 2 years with them. And I think that not only was it objectively the best side we've had on paper, I think that it was probably the best football I've ever seen Leicester play for those couple of seasons. I mean, it was absolutely. I sometimes look back at some of those matches, some of the goals we scored back then, and it was brilliant football. But I think that the problem with Rodgers is the longer he spends at a club, the worse it gets. So he's kind of like the opposite of what he claims to be, because he claims to be this developer of clubs, and he always wants more investment and whatever. But I think he's actually a very good impact manager. And you give him other people's players, and he comes in and he can get a rise out of them, and he plays very good football. But the longer it goes on, the sort of worse it gets. But for those 2 seasons at Leicester, the first 2 seasons he was there, he was brilliant. And the FA Cup win was, thoroughly deserved, with a side that, like we both said, was probably better objectively than the one that won the Premier League. Notable exceptions aside, like Kante and Mahrez, aside from those 2, it was better, I think.
And with Rodgers, it almost replicated exactly what he did at Liverpool, isn't it? I think they had 2 years where they were looking like, they could very nearly win the Premier League, and then it just all completely fell apart, as you say, when he started to bring in his own players. And it was almost the same with us. And like I said, when we got relegated shortly afterwards, I still don't know how we got relegated with some of those players we had. No. I still can't figure that one out.
Well, I watched Newcastle against Man City a couple of weeks ago when Harvey Barnes got 2 goals there. And I think, oh God, you see players like that who were in that side that got relegated. Barnes, Maddison, Tielemans, Ndidi, Vardy. I mean, it was a ridiculous squad to get relegated with.
So what went wrong there? Because Leicester won the FA Cup after losing 4 finals in its history, and then to be relegated so shortly after, and now Leicester are struggling in the Championship, second division. What's gone wrong at the club?
I think COVID hit us pretty badly. I mean, I can't really go into the complete details of it because I don't know, but I think because given that the owners made their money on duty free, I think to not have any travel, for an extended period of time really hit us badly. And then they also had this financial model where we would sell one of our assets sort of like every season. And then that just stopped happening because I think we were able to sell, Maguire was the big one, obviously 80 million to Man United. And then Chilwell we managed to sell. And that kind of dried up. I think the next one they probably would have sold would have been Tielemans, but no one came in for him. And in the end, he wound down his contract and went to Aston Villa on a free. So basically the whole financial model just completely collapsed for reasons, I probably don't completely understand. But
sorry, Phil, go on.
No, that's it, yeah.
I also think that whilst you're right about that model, because it was really successful, because we had years of signing these players for, relatively cheaply and then selling them on for bigger money, because obviously Maguire's the biggest one, but there was, Mahrez, there was Drinkwater, Kante, so it's Chilwell. So every season we were selling, maybe not our best player, but one of them for big money. And it was that season in 2021 after winning the FA Cup that we didn't sell anybody, and it was under Rodgers because he convinced them not to sell anybody. And we brought in, we spent huge money on Samare, Daka, who are still at the club now, and a couple of others. Vestergaard came in, for example. And so we were bringing in big players for big money because we just won the FA Cup. We'd narrowly missed out on Champions League, and it was sort of, I think, betting on the fact that we were always going to be in that sort of top 6, 7, maybe sort of, in Europe. And then that season, after we didn't sell anybody, we finished 8th, I think, that season, and didn't get into Europe, and it just financially destroyed us. So I think that they were betting on being in Europe long term because we'd had, 3 or 4 seasons in it. And that was a huge mistake, going against that model that had worked so well for the previous, 6 or 7 years.
Yeah, and they also spent a lot of money on that training ground, didn't they? They got this new one,
of course, yeah.
in Seagrave, which, I'm not quite sure how I feel about this. I don't think I want to advocate having worse facilities, but part of me feels they're maybe a little bit too comfortable there. They're sort of out the way. It's sort of the ivory tower, and I'm kind of reminded of, remember that Sunderland documentary when they went down? They had all these luxury facilities that they couldn't afford anymore. And I don't know. I'm veering into conspiracy really, but I think it's kind of like ever since they opened that new training ground, it all nosedive a bit.
I agree. I think that because when they were at the previous one, Beaver Drive, which was just in a residential area of Leicester, and so they sort of go to for want of a better word, like a normal environment, and having to be interacting with people that were just sort of everyday people. And now they're sort of off in North Leicestershire, in the middle of nowhere, in a place that looks like a luxury spa. I think that can have an impact.
Yeah.
So what of the future for Leicester then? So they're struggling in the Championship as we record. Are Leicester going to make a return and become a regular Premier League club, or are they heading towards the 3rd division once more? What do you guys think?
I'm not particularly optimistic. One comparison I made recently is that they remind me a little bit of Man United in the sense that we could just continuously change managers. But it's something, higher up doesn't seem quite right. It doesn't seem very well run at the moment. They're making baffling decisions. There's this ongoing battle, obviously with the director of football, it was John Rudkin and all of that. And it's just, this seems to be quite a lot of turmoil, and they seem to be repeatedly making bad decisions. It's like last season when they brought in Van Nistelrooy as manager. That baffled me. I really don't understand what that was about. And it just seems to be the opposite of what they were a few years ago, where they were just making a lot of very good decisions and their recruitment was great. And it just seems to be the opposite now. So to be horribly pessimistic, I think we're heading downward rather than upward. What do you think, Pete?
I agree. I think I'd say that we're closer to the third tier than we are to getting back into the Premier League. And I agree. I don't think I wouldn't blame the current manager, because I actually quite like Cifuentes. When he was appointed, he did a decent job at QPR. He'd done a decent job at clubs in Scandinavia as well. And he came across very well. And I don't blame it on him particularly. But having said that, I do think that I thought the same years ago when Pearson was first appointed, when we went down to League One. It seemed like, it doesn't matter who the manager is. We were on a downward trajectory. We were going down to League One. We had 3 managers that season. It didn't matter who it was. We were going to get relegated anyway. So sometimes it can take just a manager to galvanise a club. So part of me thinks that as well. Maybe we just need the right manager to come in, because we've not got a bad group of players. But I am inclined to agree with you in that I think that it does seem there's something toxic going on at the club in general. And it doesn't help that, we've relied on Vardy for 13 years, and then 13 years later he leaves and you realise we haven't got a striker. And we're still with just Jordan Ayew and Patson Daka up front. There's so many things that we could go into, but...
Well, also recently they haven't really been able to make a proper signing, because last January when we were, fighting relegation, I think they brought in one random right back who barely played, and then this season it's been 3 loan signings essentially, hasn't it? So they can't. Something isn't quite right financially either.
And one of those loan signings has been our best player this season, Jordan James.
Yeah.
And that is quite a sign of things are going pretty badly. If you're a side that's just been in the Premier League, you're getting a guy in on loan on transfer deadline day, and he's your best player. That's worrying as a club. So I'd say that we're definitely closer to League One than we are to the Premier League.
I will say one upside though. I think the youth setup is still quite good, because we've got a winger this season, Jeremy Monga, and he looks pretty special. So I think the capacity to create some good youth players is obviously still there. So that's kind of my big hope, really.
But me too. But the thing that disappoints me about things currently is the fact that we've actually got another centre back, Ben Nelson, who was on loan at Oxford last season and did very well by all accounts there. Maresca was actually playing him the last season we were in the Championship. He was easing him in, and we haven't been playing him as much. He broke into the side recently and then got injured. So I sometimes think we're creating these young players, but are we giving them enough of an opportunity? Monga aside, because Monga seems like he's going to be an absolute superstar. But I feel like we've got competent players that we're not easing them into the setup quickly enough, like other clubs do.
Well, to end on a more positive note, guys, rather than looking at the current terrible state at the moment, let's look back at the past to end. Which do you prefer, the King Power Stadium or Filbert Street?
I'm going to have to say Filbert Street. It's just... Of course, they had to move into a bigger stadium, and modern football stadiums. There is a reason, why you have to move into a new one as opposed to constantly update the old one. But Filbert Street was the first game I went to, and the South Stand there. You can't replicate that, can you? I don't know. What do you think, Pete?
Well, I think that I agree, but I also think that the good thing about the current ground is the fact that for years it kind of felt a little bit soulless, as a lot of these new grounds do that all look the same. Our ground is essentially, you look at Southampton's ground, which was built around the same time, it's the same ground but blue. So it felt a little bit soulless for years. But then I think the good thing about the current ground is it has created its own history, because we won the league in this ground and all the rest of it. So it's nice that it's got its own identity and its own history to it now. But I'm like you. I grew up going to Filbert Street, and the atmosphere back then and the way it was, it was just part of me and my dad going to the football when I was a kid, I'll always say Filbert Street.
But also you had like Bentley's roof where people would stand on the top of the Bentley's building and see into the ground and things like that. But what I will say is I'm actually really glad. I mean, the old ground and the new ground are pretty much right next to each other. You know, they didn't do this thing which some places have done where they sort of moved their new ground out near the motorway. That would have been really horrible. So I'm really, really glad that they're more or less in the same place. So it's, you know, I'm not mourning Filbert Street that much.
Well, I never managed to get to Filbert Street, but it was a bit of an odd ground in the sense that on two sides it was two very small stands where you could see like the terraced houses behind, and then that huge main stand that didn't last very long before it was. I think they finished at 94, 95 or something, and then like within 10 years or so it was gone.
Well, there was the Carling stand, which was the one that my dad and I sat in at the end, which was the latest developed one, which looked like a proper like good Premier League ground. Those two stands, but yeah, like you say, the other two stands were just. Well, Martin O'Neill used to say that whenever he made a new signing or he was trying to make a new signing, he'd like lead them out sort of backwards out of the tunnel to show them the stadium, so that he wouldn't come out and have to face those two little stands.
Yeah, it was an odd looking ground, but it did have its charms about it, and Luton is kind of almost like the last ground to be in a similar kind of look where you have to walk through houses to get into the stadium. So things have certainly moved on. Okay then, guys. Well, that's it for the latest episode of the Football Culture Podcast. You can follow us on all of the social media sites, Twitter, Instagram, etc. We're the Football Culture Podcast. Many thanks to Pete and Phil for discussing football in Leicester today. And we'll see you on the next episode.
Cheers.
So...